The courtroom was unnervingly silent as 6-year-old Lucy Hart stepped through the heavy wooden doors, her tiny hand clutching the leash of Ranger, the search and rescue dog who had once pulled her from a collapsing barn during a blizzard. Outside, snow drifted past the frosted windows in slow, ghost-like sheets, driven by a northern Minnesota wind sharp enough to split bark. Inside, the overhead lamps cast a tired amber glow. An old courthouse that had seen decades of disputes, but never one quite like this. Everyone rose as Judge Owen Miller entered, his black robe brushing the rails, his eyes carrying the quiet ache of a man who had buried a daughter 10 years earlier. He had presided over hundreds of cases, many darker than the Midwest winters he lived through. Yet something about today felt heavier. As he settled into his seat, his gaze drifted toward Lucy. She looked impossibly small inside her navy puffer coat, her boots barely brushing the floor. At her side, Ranger moved with the steadiness of a seasoned protector. The golden retriever's coat, thick and winter-ready, shimmered softly beneath the courtroom lights. A faint, jagged scar along his flank caught Judge Miller's eye, an old battle mark from the night he'd saved Lucy's life. The dog paused, sniffing the air, his muscles instantly tightening. Lucy hesitated, then took 2 small steps forward. She did not speak. She hadn't spoken a single word for nearly 3 months. The trauma of the blizzard, the night she vanished, the hours trapped under rotting beams, things no child should ever endure, had severed her voice. Not even her mother, Hannah Hart, could coax a whisper from her. Now, as they reached the witness stand, Hannah leaned down and murmured, her voice trembling, "You okay, honey?" Lucy didn't respond. Instead, she reached for Ranger, resting her hand along his back, grounding herself in the warmth of the only being she fully trusted. Across the courtroom, Charles Denton watched with unsettling calm. His suit was ironed to perfection, his coat draped neatly over the back of his chair. In this small Midwestern town, Charles was known as a generous business owner, a church donor, a man who always shook hands firm and smiled wide. Yet as his gaze slid over Lucy, something sharp flickered behind his eyes. Cold, calculating. Ranger felt it first. A low rumble traveled through his chest, his tail stiffening as he stepped closer to the girl. Judge Miller straightened. "Mr. Denton, is there going to be a problem?" His tone was neutral, but his stare was pointed. Denton raised his palms in an easy shrug. "Not at all, Your Honor. Just surprised to see the child here today." His voice had that unmistakable Midwest drawl, soft, warm, deceptively ordinary, the kind of voice you might hear while buying groceries or discussing property taxes, the kind of voice you never suspect of cruelty. But Lucy suspected. Her fingers curled tightly into Ranger's fur, knuckles turning white. Emma Walsh, the prosecutor, stepped forward. "Your Honor, the child is not here to testify verbally. She will communicate solely through gestures acknowledged and certified by her therapist." She glanced gently at Lucy. "We are not forcing a word from her." Judge Miller nodded, though his brows pinched. He had read the psychological report. selective mutism triggered by trauma. Still, something in his chest whispered that there was more, something fragile, trembling beneath the surface. As Emma guided Lucy into the witness seat, the room leaned into a tension so thick it seemed to hush even the storm outside. Denton crossed his legs, feigning boredom. Hannah clasped her hands together, whispering silent prayers. Ranger sat upright, chest expanded, eyes locked onto the defendant with unwavering resolve. Judge Miller lifted a hand. Before we begin, let the record show that this is not a typical witness examination. The child will... He stopped mid-sentence. Lucy had raised her hand. Her small finger traced a slow, delicate circle in the air. Ranger reacted instantly. His body stiffened. His ears snapped forward. A deep, primal growl rose from his throat. Not the restless bark of a startled dog, but a sound steeped in recognition and warning. Denton's face drained of color. Several jurors gasped. Hannah clapped a hand over her mouth. Emma froze, eyes widening. Judge Miller leaned forward, heart hammering against his ribs. "What? Did that child just signal?" he whispered, voice cracking the silence. The room held its breath, and Ranger took one step toward the defendant. Before the winter storm rewrote her world, Lucy Hart had been the heartbeat of Maple Avenue, a bright, barefoot kid who chased cardinals through fresh powder and drew little whiskered cats on the frosted windows of her mother's Subaru. Neighbors knew her laugh before they knew her name, a bell-like sound that floated across the cul-de-sac each afternoon when school let out. Her wishes back then were small and tender. Hot cocoa after dinner, one more bedtime story, a warm hug before sleep. Home meant safe. Home meant simple. And for a while that was enough. But trauma does not ask permission. It sweeps in like a rogue blizzard, burying everything in its path. The night she disappeared carved a canyon through her spirit. When the rescue team carried her out from beneath the collapsed beams, Lucy's voice, once quick and cheerful, was gone. Not broken, not injured, just absent. A door slammed shut somewhere deep inside her, and even warmth could not pry it open. Doctors called it selective mutism, a psychological freeze in the wake of overwhelming fear. Hannah, her mother, heard the phrase but could not absorb it. All she saw was her little girl staring into corners as if listening for ghosts. At home, silence thickened like ice on the lake. Lucy no longer drew cats. She no longer reached for her mother's hand. When thunder cracked or a truck downshifted on the main road, she bolted upright, clutching her blanket so hard the seams frayed. Nights were the worst. Her small body curled tight, breath shallow, eyes wide open, as though darkness itself might yank her away again. Hannah tried storybooks, warm baths, herbal teas, even soothing acoustic playlists that therapists recommended. Nothing thawed the stiffness in her daughter's shoulders. Nothing slowed her trembling. And in the privacy of her bathroom, behind a locked door, Hannah let herself fall apart. "Please," she whispered to the mirror, "please give her voice back. I'll take anything else. Just not this. The only creature Lucy allowed near her was Ranger, the search and rescue dog, still nursing scars from his own accident, seemed to sense her fractures instinctively. He followed her from room to room with a gentle patience, lying at the foot of her bed like a silent sentinel. When she startled awake, he rested his head against her ribs until her breathing returned to normal. When she stood shaking in the living room doorway, he moved in front of her, steady and immovable, like a shield carved from golden warmth. It wasn't affection alone. It was recognition. Ranger knew what it meant to survive something that tried to end you. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the frozen tree line, Hannah knelt beside her daughter near the fireplace. "Sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a stray curl behind Lucy's ear. "If you can't talk yet, that's okay. You don't have to. Just let me hold you." Lucy didn't move. Her eyes tracked a flicker of firelight as though searching for an answer she didn't know how to speak. Then, quietly, Ranger nudged Lucy's shoulder with his muzzle. She leaned into him, just barely, but enough for Hannah to cover her mouth to hide a sob. That single movement felt like the first crack in the ice, a sign of life, a sign of hope. Still, Lucy's buried wish, the one she could no longer articulate, remained painfully clear. "Don't let anyone touch me again. Don't let the dark find me. Keep me safe." It was a wish Hannah carried too, heavy as a sandbag on her chest. Neither of them yet understood that Ranger had already heard that wish, already sworn himself to it. And in a quiet, determined way, the dog seemed to know something else, something Hannah couldn't begin to imagine. Lucy's silence wasn't the only thing hiding a truth. A shadow from that night still lingered, and the man who cast it was sitting comfortably in the heart of their town, waiting for the storm to pass. The storm that swallowed Lucy Hart arrived without mercy. By late afternoon, the sky over northern Minnesota had turned the color of bruised steel, and the wind howled across Maple Avenue like a warning no one wanted to hear. Hannah Hart was already pulling on her hospital scrubs, preparing for a double shift at St. Luke's Medical Center. The roads were slick, the air bitter, but winter shifts paid overtime, and she needed every dollar now more than ever. "Lucy, sweetheart, Megan will be here any minute," Hannah said, kneeling to zip up her daughter's fleece hoodie. The little girl didn't answer. She only watched the swirling snow outside the window, Ranger curled protectively at her feet. Hannah kissed her forehead, lingering longer than usual. "I'll be home before you wake up." Megan Larson, college freshman, cheerful, dependable, arrived just before the storm reached full force. "We'll be okay, Ms. Hart," she said, shaking flakes from her beanie. "I've lived here my whole life. Storms don't scare me." Hannah smiled politely, though her stomach felt tight. Something about the air, about Lucy's trembling, about the oppressive quiet pressing against the walls. It all felt wrong. By 7 o'clock, the blizzard hit with a violence no one predicted. Wind screamed through the pine trees, rattling gutters, pounding the old siding like a furious fist. The lights flickered twice before cutting out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. Megan lit a handful of candles. It's okay, Lucy. See? Cozy, right? But the moment she turned toward the kitchen to grab more matches, a sharp bang echoed from the back porch, then another, like a door slamming against its hinges. Lucy? Megan called, stepping toward the hallway. No answer. She hurried faster. Her phone flashlight jittered across the floorboards. The draft grew stronger, swirling flakes gathering on the linoleum. When she reached the mudroom, the back door hung wide open, banging against the siding in the violent wind. Lucy was gone. Panic shot through Megan like electric wire. Lucy! Lucy! Her voice was swallowed instantly by the storm. She grabbed her coat, waded into the yard, screaming for help until her throat burned. But the wind ripped her cries away. She stumbled back inside. To call 911, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone. Across town, the search and rescue pager sounded. Captain Brooks scanned the message. Child missing. Blizzard conditions. Respond immediately. He turned to his team. Bring Ranger. The golden retriever had been semi-retired since the barn collapse that scarred his side. But tonight they needed a dog who understood fear the way humans never could. Ranger bounded into the truck without hesitation, snow already clinging to his fur. His breath steamed into the dark as the team sped toward Maple Avenue, tires crunching through drifts. You think the dog's ready for this, Captain? One rescuer asked. Brooks glanced at Ranger. The dog's gaze was fixed forward, unblinking. He's ready. He knows this kid. At the Hart residence, Ranger locked onto Lucy's scent immediately. Through howling winds and buried footprints, he pushed forward. The team followed behind him in single file, leaning into the storm. Every few yards, Ranger paused, lifted his head, and then bolted in a new direction. Whatever trail he sensed was fading fast. Finally, he stopped at the old Denton property. A sprawling shed and barn, long abandoned but never demolished. Snow slammed into the rotting structure, bending the tin roof. Ranger barked, frantic, circling the collapsed entrance. Brooks forced the door open just as a section of rafters groaned under the weight of the snow. Inside, the beam gave way. The team dove in. Ranger lunged forward, weaving through wreckage until he found her. Curled beneath a fallen work table, cheeks pale, breath shallow, jacket torn. Her small fingers twitched in the cold. Ranger pressed his body against her, warming her with his fur, refusing to move even as the wind howled through broken boards. Lucy turned her head, lips quivering. Her voice, thin, broken, escaped into the darkness. Cold, please. 2 words, her last, for months. Brooks lifted her into his arms. You're safe now, kiddo. He's got you. He nodded at Ranger. Rate medium. This dog just beat the storm. The team raced through the blizzard. Lucy against Brooks's chest, Ranger never more than a step away. And though no one realized it yet, the storm that nearly took her had delivered something else. A clue. One that tied her disappearance to the last man anyone in town would suspect. In a town like Frosthaven, Minnesota, reputations were carved in ice. slow to form and slow to melt. Charles Denton had spent 20 years polishing his. He owned the region's largest logistics company, donated generously to local schools, funded the town's Christmas lights each December, and never missed a Sunday sermon. Folks called him the backbone of the community, the kind of man you trusted with your mortgage papers or your mother's casserole recipe. But that winter, with Lucy Hart recovering from the blizzard, something about him began to flicker, too subtly for most to notice, but not too subtly for a child who had seen his shadow in the dark. 3 days after the rescue, Denton arrived at the Hart home with a steaming container of chicken noodle soup and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hannah, exhausted and grateful for any kindness, opened the door. "Charles, you really didn't have to," she said. He waved off the comment politely. "Nonsense, Hannah. When a child goes missing in my community, I take that personally. I figured you could use something warm." Ranger stood between Denton and Lucy, who peeked from behind the recliner. The dog's posture stiffened immediately, his tail low, his muscles taut. Denton glanced down at him with a tight grin. "Easy, boy. Just visiting." But Ranger wasn't having it. A low, guttural growl rolled through his chest, the kind of instinctive warning a rescue dog rarely used unless danger was close. His hackles lifted in a sharp ridge. "Charles, he's never growled at anyone before," Hannah murmured, embarrassed. Denton raised his brows in a theatrical expression of surprise. "Well, animals pick up on stress. I'm sure he's just being protective." Yet the way he stepped back, almost too quickly, betrayed something else. Fear? Recognition? Guilt? Lucy's breath hitched. Her small fingers curled into Ranger's fur. The room felt colder, as though the storm had found a way inside. Trying to ease the tension, Hannah forced a smile. "Thank you for the soup, really." Before leaving, Denton bent slightly, attempting to catch Lucy's gaze. "Hope you feel better soon, sweetheart," he said. His voice dipped lower, smoother, too smooth. Lucy recoiled instantly, pressing her face into Ranger's side. Denton straightened, the polite smile slipping for a fraction of a second, revealing something sharp beneath. On his way out, he paused by the doorway. "You know," he said softly, "old barns can be dangerous. Kids wander, structures collapse. You're lucky she made it out." His tone was casual, too casual. Hannah felt a faint prickle at the base of her neck. After he left, the house settled into silence. Lucy lifted her head, eyes wide, trembling. She tapped Ranger's shoulder twice, an instinctive signal she hadn't used since the blizzard. Ranger shifted closer, resting his body against hers, shielding her from a threat only she seemed to recognize. Hannah knelt beside her daughter. "Sweetheart, what scared you?" Lucy didn't answer, but the look she gave, the frozen, hollow stare, was the same one she'd had the night the rescue team carried her out. And for the first time, Hannah wondered if her daughter had seen something, or someone, the night she disappeared. Meanwhile, across town, Detective Alan Pierce reviewed Megan Larson's interview transcript. Her statement echoed in his mind, I heard a man call her name. I thought it was her dad. But Lucy's father had been gone for years. Pierce leaned back in his chair. A man calling Lucy during a blackout, right before she vanished. His pen tapped the desk. Denton's name, circled twice, stared back at him. Back at the Hart home, Ranger remained planted at Lucy's side, vigilant, unmoving, eyes fixed on the window as though expecting someone or something to return. Whatever happened in that barn wasn't an accident, and Ranger knew it. The therapy room at Dr. Eleanor James's clinic smelled faintly of cedarwood and chamomile, a soft contrast to the sharp winter air outside. Frost crept along the edges of the window pane, and the faint hum of a space heater filled the quiet, an intentional quiet, designed to feel safe, not suffocating. Hannah sat with her hands knotted in her lap, watching her daughter perched on the cushioned mat beside Ranger. Lucy leaned lightly against the dog's shoulder, her breaths small and steady, as though she could disappear into his fur if she stayed still enough. Dr. James, calm, silver-haired, with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime listening to broken voices, pulled a small wooden stool closer. "Lucy," she said gently, "you don't have to talk if you're not ready. I'm not here to make you speak. I'm here to help you say things in another way." Lucy didn't lift her gaze. Ranger shifted, nudging her with a slow sweep of his tail. "She hasn't had a sound come out since the night they found her," Hannah whispered. "Not even a cry." Dr. James nodded. Selective mutism can be the mind's way of protecting itself, sometimes creating another language, a private language, helps children feel control again. She placed a blank sheet of paper and a pack of markers on the mat. "Lucy, I'm going to ask you something different today. Could you draw a shape? Any shape. Something only you and Ranger understand." Silence stretched long and thin. Lucy's small fingers hovered above the markers, twitching once, twice. Her eyes flicked toward Ranger, who waited with quiet patience, as though he himself knew exactly what question was being asked. 10 seconds passed. 20, a minute. Then Lucy lifted her trembling hand and drew a slow, fragile circle in the air. Not on the paper, not with the marker. Just her, finger tracing an invisible loop. Ranger reacted instantly. His head snapped up, his ears pricked forward. He pressed himself closer to her, resting his chin gently across her knee. Hannah gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, Ranger knows that? What does it mean?" Dr. James leaned forward, eyes narrowed with fascination rather than alarm. "It means the child has already built her own language, and that dog understands it." She turned to Lucy. "Sweetheart, did you use that signal the night of the storm?" Lucy's shoulders tensed. Her lower lip trembled, but she didn't shake her head. She didn't nod either. Instead, she repeated the motion, a small circle drawn slowly, like a memory surfacing. Ranger let out a low, mournful sound. Not anger, Recognition. Hannah looked from her daughter to the dog, tears gathering. "I thought the storm hurt her," she whispered. "But that signal, did someone try to—" Her voice broke before she could finish the sentence. Dr. James placed a steadying hand on Hannah's. "We don't jump to conclusions, but Lucy remembers something important, and Ranger remembers it too." A knock interrupted them. Detective Alan Pierce. He stepped inside, softening his tone at the sight of Lucy. "Sorry to barge in, but I need an update." Dr. James motioned him closer and quietly explained the signal. Pierce's expression shifted. First curiosity, then intensity. "If that gesture means danger or recognition, that dog could be the key to understanding what happened in that barn." Lucy stiffened. Pierce noticed. He kneeled slowly, staying at her eye level. "Lucy, if someone scared you that night, you don't have to talk. You don't have to point. You can just use your signal. Ranger will tell us the rest." Lucy met his gaze briefly, just enough for a flicker of fear to betray itself. "Time 300 malms." Then, slowly, deliberately, she drew the circle again. Ranger pressed harder against her. Pierce stood, jaw tight. "That's enough for me. Someone was in that barn with her." Hannah's breath hitched. Dr. James folded her hands. "Whoever it was, Lucy and Ranger already remember him." Outside, the wind rattled the clinic windows, but inside, for the first time, Hannah felt a shift. A terrifying, crucial truth had begun to thaw its way to the surface, and someone in Frosthaven had every reason to fear that tiny, trembling circle. Detective Alan Pierce knew the look on Megan Larson's face the moment she stepped into the Frosthaven Police Department. Eyes swollen, hands trembling, shoulders pressed inward like she was bracing for a blow. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. Fear wrapped in uncertainty, the kind that eats away at a person until the truth forces its way out. He motioned her toward the interview room. "Megan, take your time. Just start wherever you can." She nodded shakily, fingers twisting the strap of her canvas tote. I didn't want to mess this up," she whispered. "I care about Lucy. I'd never hurt her. Never." Pierce softened his voice. "We all know that. We just need to understand what happened the night of the storm." Megan swallowed hard. "The power went out around 7. I lit some candles. I thought I heard something. A voice." She hesitated, terror creeping into her expression. A man's voice, calling her name. "Lucy's name?" Pierce asked. "Yes, clear as day. I thought maybe her dad came back into the picture or something. I didn't know what else to think, but it didn't sound right." Pierce tapped his pen lightly. "Describe the voice." Megan shivered. Deep, confident. The kind of voice people listen to without questioning. But there was something else. Something wrong. Like he was coaxing her. Pierce's pulse quickened. That description fit only a handful of men in Frosthaven. and one name circled his mind like a vulture. "Did you see him?" he asked. Megan shook her head violently. "No, I ran toward the sound, but the back door was open and the snow blew in. Lucy was gone. I thought she wandered out. I prayed she wandered out." "What made you come forward now?" he asked gently. Megan wrung her hands, breath quivering. "Because I saw him yesterday, at the grocery store. He smiled at everyone like nothing happened, like he wasn't near that house that night." Her voice fell to a trembling whisper. "It was Charles Denton." Pierce kept his face carefully still. "Are you certain?" "No," she admitted, voice breaking. "That's the worst part. I'm not certain, but it sounded like him. And Lucy—" her voice faltered. "Lucy hid behind the cereal display when he passed us. She clung to me so hard I had bruises." Pierce closed the case file, his jaw tightening as he aligned the new information with the therapy session earlier that day. A secret signal. A dog that reacted to a silent gesture. A child who froze at the mention of a man's name. "You did the right thing coming in," he said quietly. "You helped her." Megan covered her face with her hands. "I should have done more. I should have—" Pierce cut her off gently. "You're not the villain here." Meanwhile, at the Hart home, Hannah sat with Lucy on the living room floor, Ranger curled protectively around them. The air inside felt warmer than the biting winds outside, but the tension clung to the room like a shadow. Lucy rested her palm on Ranger's chest, tracing the rhythm of his breathing. With him, she didn't need words. Hannah touched her daughter's shoulder. "Baby, did someone call your name that night?" Lucy stiffened. She didn't look up. Instead, her finger drew the small, trembling circle in the air. Ranger growled. Not loud, but deep and certain. Fear washed through Hannah, cold as the December storm. Something inside her twisted with a realization she didn't want to accept. Her daughter hadn't wandered into that barn. Someone had led her there. Pierce's voice crackled through the phone when he called moments later. "Hannah, I think we have a connection. Megan just identified a potential suspect." "Charles?" Hannah whispered. Pierce didn't breathe for 2 seconds. "We're not jumping yet. But, yes, his name came up." Her heart pounded in her throat as she looked at Lucy, curled against Ranger, silent, but clearly remembering something she couldn't call aloud. Pierce exhaled slowly. If Denton was there the night of the storm, then he'll try to cover his tracks. We need to move fast. "What do you need me to do?" Hannah asked. "Watch Lucy," Pierce said, "and watch Ranger, because right now that dog may be the only one who truly knows what happened." Snow drifted past the windows again, ghost-like and cold. But for the first time, the storm wasn't outside. It was already inside their home. The hallway outside the Frosthaven County Prosecutor's office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paper, an odor familiar to anyone who'd spent long winters chasing justice in small Midwestern towns. Emma Walsh, lead prosecutor, stood by the window overlooking the frozen lake, flipping through the latest reports Detective Pierce had sent. Her jaw flexed as she read Megan's statement again and again. A man's voice. Lucy's terror. Ranger's unmistakable reactions. Every piece of the puzzle pointed in one direction. But suspicion wasn't enough to bring down a man as beloved and as slippery as Charles Denton. They needed courage. They needed clarity. And they needed testimony only one person in town could give. Lucy Hart. Emma closed the folder and turned as Pierce walked in, frost still melting from his coat. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. Pierce huffed a humorless laugh. "Didn't. Been reviewing timelines, phone records, property maps. Everything points toward Denton, but it's all circumstantial. He's too careful, too damn respected." He paused. "We need more." "And we have it," Emma said quietly. Pierce studied her. "You're not seriously considering putting Lucy on the stand." "I am. Hannah will never agree. And even if she did, Lucy hasn't spoken in months." Emma crossed her arms, resolve hardening. "Words aren't the only way to tell the truth. That child communicates with Ranger through gestures more precise than any deposition. Her signal nearly sent Denton through the floor. The jury saw that fear. Judge Miller saw it." Pierce paced the room. "Emma, she's 6. She's traumatized. If Denton even looks at her the wrong way..." Emma cut in sharply. "And what happens if we don't stop him? What other child disappears next time he gets an opportunity?" She stepped closer. "You saw Lucy. You saw what Ranger did. That gesture means something. And Denton knows it." Pierce stopped moving. His silence meant consent. Moments later, Hannah arrived. Exhausted, eyes red from sleepless nights, Lucy clinging to Ranger's collar by her side. Emma softened instantly. "Hannah, thank you for coming." Hannah's voice was brittle. "You said it was urgent." Emma knelt so she was level with Lucy, who kept one hand buried in Ranger's fur. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "no one is going to make you talk. No one is going to touch you. But we do need your help. And Ranger's." Lucy blinked, watching Emma with quiet suspicion. Hannah swallowed hard. "What are you asking us to do?" Emma stood. "Bring Lucy to court. Let her use her gesture. Let Ranger respond. Let the jury see the truth with their own eyes." Hannah's face drained of color. "Emma." She wakes up screaming without making a sound. She flinches when the furnace kicks in. She can't handle a courtroom. Her voice cracked. "I can't put her through that." Ranger nudged Lucy gently, as though urging her to step closer. And she did, inch by inch, until she stood beside Emma, her tiny fingers gripping the dog's fur like a lifeline. Emma lowered her voice. "Hannah, Denton is dangerous. You know that now. If we don't act, this town will keep trusting him. He'll keep smiling, and he'll stay free." Tears gathered in Hannah's eyes. She looked at her daughter. So small, so fragile. Then at the dog who never left her side. Finally, she whispered, "If Ranger is with her, I'll agree." Emma exhaled, relief and fear mingling. "We'll make the courtroom safe. Judge Miller is already preparing accommodations. You're not alone in this." Pierce stepped forward. "I'll personally make sure Denton never gets within 10 feet of her." Lucy, hearing the name, stiffened. Her hand lifted unconsciously, tracing the faint beginning of a circle in the air. Ranger's ears shot up. Emma froze. Pierce muttered, "Yeah, she's ready." Outside, snow began to fall again. A thin, whispering layer, as though the sky itself braced for what was coming. The next storm wouldn't be made of ice. It would be made of truth. The Frost Haven County courthouse buzzed with a tension that felt almost electric, an undercurrent running beneath the shuffle of boots over old hardwood floors, beneath the murmurs of reporters adjusting their recorders, beneath the rustle of winter coats still dusted with snow. This was the biggest trial the town had seen in decades, and for many locals it was unthinkable that Charles Denton, the man whose smiling face hung on plaques across every community center, was sitting at the defendant's table. But today, their disbelief would meet the cold edge of reality. Hannah Hart held Lucy's hand tightly as they entered the courtroom. Ranger padded beside them, his presence firm, calm, anchoring the trembling child to something solid. Lucy wore a soft gray sweater and snow boots still damp from the slush outside. She looked more like a child headed to story time than a witness in a case that could shatter a town's illusions. When Judge Owen Miller entered, everyone rose. His gaze fell on Lucy almost immediately. She stood half-hidden behind Ranger's shoulder, her fingers curled in his fur. Miller's expression softened. Just a flicker, but enough to betray his worry for her. "Please be seated," he said. But the room didn't relax. Not really. Across the aisle, Charles Denton adjusted his tie, flashing a courteous smile toward the gallery. But when his eyes landed on Lucy, something in his posture shifted. A slight tension, a subtle tightening of his jaw. Ranger sensed it. His ears pricked forward. His muscles tightened. Emma leaned down to Hannah. "We keep Lucy out of direct confrontation. When it's her turn, Ranger stays with her. Judge Miller already signed off on it." Hannah nodded shakily. "Thank you." As the trial opened, Emma delivered her statement with a calm conviction sharpened by weeks of sleepless nights. "This case is about a child," she said. "A night of terror, and a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored." She paced slowly, her boots tapping lightly against the floor. "The evidence may not speak loudly, but someone else can." Her gaze drifted toward Lucy, just for a moment. When it was the defense's turn, Michael Weaver, Denton's lawyer, strode confidently to the center. "This case, ladies and gentlemen, is built on fear, not facts. A storm, a missing child, a rumor." He gestured dismissively toward Ranger. "And a dog whose reactions are being treated as evidence." The comment stirred murmurs across the room. Ranger stood straighter, sensing the shift. Then came the moment everyone dreaded, bringing Lucy to the stand. Hannah carried her daughter toward the witness chair, But when they reached it, Lucy refused to climb up. Her legs locked. Her breath hitched sharply. Denton watched with unsettling calm, as though admiring a painting. Judge Miller quickly intervened. The child may remain beside the support animal. She is not required to sit in the chair. Hannah knelt beside Lucy. Sweetheart, Ranger's right here. He's not going anywhere. Lucy's wide eyes flicked toward Denton, and in that instant, Ranger stepped forward, positioning himself directly between them. Emma approached with slow, cautious steps. Lucy, you don't have to speak. You just show us what you showed Dr. James. Lucy didn't move. Denton smirked, leaning back in his chair, whispering something to his attorney. That was when everything changed. Lucy lifted her small hand and traced the circle. The air in the courtroom seemed to shatter. Ranger lunged, not violently, but with fierce recognition, planting himself between Lucy and Denton, a rumbling growl vibrating the floor. Gasps echoed through the room. Reporters scrambled for their cameras. Hannah wrapped her arms around her daughter, shielding her even as Ranger did the same. Judge Miller slammed his gavel. Order! Order in this courtroom! But no one in the room was looking at the judge. Every eye was locked on Denton. His face had drained of color. His composure, so carefully built, was cracking, and for the first time, he looked afraid. Not of the, court. Not of the evidence, but of the tiny girl who had raised her hand, and the dog who remembered what she could not say aloud. The wind cut across the Denton property like a blade, sharp, relentless, carrying with it the distant groan of ice bending under winter's weight. Detective Alan Pierce pulled his collar up as he and two officers trudged through the snow toward the derelict barn. Ranger trotted beside him, focused, alert, his breath forming heavy clouds in the freezing air. This wasn't just another search. This was the place where Lucy Hart's nightmare had begun. And Pierce needed answers no forensic report had yet provided. The barn loomed ahead, skeletal and half-collapsed, boards warped by decades of frost. Even in daylight, it looked haunted. The storm months earlier had torn holes through the roof, allowing slivers of pale light to slice through the dusty interior like thin, ghostly fingers. Ranger halted at the threshold. "Something wrong, boy?" Pierce murmured. Ranger didn't bark. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, nose low, tracing an invisible trail along the warped floorboards. The moment they entered, the air felt heavier, colder than the wind outside, almost charged. Ranger inhaled deeply, then followed a narrow path toward the collapsed section where Lucy had been found. His movements sharpened, purposeful and tense. Pierce lifted his flashlight. "Fan out," he instructed. "Look for anything that doesn't belong." The officers began searching through debris, overturned crates, and rusted tools. Pierce crouched next to the fallen support beam, running his gloved hand over the wood. Something caught his eye. A patch of splintered marks, shallow yet deliberate. Ranger growled softly. Pierce shone his light closer. Scratch marks, small ones, fingernail size. He swallowed hard. Lucy tried to get out. Ranger moved past him abruptly, circling the area, nose to the ground, tail stiffened in a tight line. Then, in a motion so sudden it startled Pierce, Ranger jerked his head toward the far wall, a section where the boards looked newer than the rest, as if someone had replaced them recently. "You found something," Pierce murmured. Ranger pressed his paw against the wall and let out a low, urgent whine. Pierce signaled the officers. "Help me with this panel." They pried the wood free, revealing a hidden space barely wide enough for a grown man to stand. Inside, the dust looked disturbed, footprints overlapping footprints, large ones. Pierce stepped back. Someone was in here, waiting. One officer lifted a piece of fabric from a nail jutting out of the beam. "Sir, this looks like a child's jacket." Pierce felt his chest tighten. "Bag it, now." Ranger suddenly growled louder, an unmistakable warning. He spun toward a pile of broken lumber, pawing frantically. When Pierce moved the boards aside, a discarded work glove fell out. A leather glove, with an embossed Denton Logistics logo. Pierce exhaled sharply. "You've got to be kidding me." The second officer stepped forward. "Could someone have planted it?" Pierce shook his head. "No. Denton wouldn't leave something this obvious unless he panicked during the storm." Ranger circled again, then did something that rooted Pierce to the floor. He stopped, looked directly at the glove, and traced a circle on the ground with his paw. The same signal Lucy used in court. Pierce whispered, "Jesus." He was here. Denton was here with her. Ranger sat beside the glove, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the evidence as if guarding it. Pierce lifted the glove gingerly with tweezers. "We take this straight to Emma. No delays." As they exited the barn, the snow began to fall again, soft and deceptively peaceful. But Pierce felt none of its quiet beauty. He felt only the storm gathering inside the courthouse. He glanced at Ranger. "You ready to face him again, boy?" Ranger didn't look away from the barn. He stood tall, resolute. He remembered. And Denton would soon learn what happens when a dog remembers the truth a child cannot speak. When the courtroom reconvened the next morning, the air felt different, charged, brittle, like the moment before lightning touches ground. Word had already spread through Frosthaven. New evidence had surfaced. Real evidence. The gallery filled early, townspeople hurrying through the cold, with the kind of urgency reserved for history-making days. Hannah sat in the front row, Lucy tucked close beside her, with Ranger sprawled protectively at her feet. The golden retriever's head rested on his paws, but his eyes never stopped watching the door where Charles Denton would enter. Detective Pierce arrived shortly after, carrying a sealed evidence bag and the gravity of someone who knew the truth was about to tear a hole through the town's illusions. He nodded once to Emma. She nodded back. No words needed. At precisely 9 a.m., Denton entered the courtroom flanked by his attorney. His face was pale, his confident stride reduced to a stiff, uneven walk. And the moment Ranger lifted his head and stared directly at him, Denton hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but enough for the jurors to notice. Judge Miller called the session to order. "Ms. Walsh, you may proceed." Emma rose from her seat, her steps steady, her voice measured. "Your Honor, yesterday's recess allowed law enforcement to conduct a deeper investigation of the Denton property, specifically the barn where Lucy Hart was found. We now have physical evidence suggesting the defendant was present at the scene." Weaver sprang to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Emma held up the evidence bag, silencing him. Inside, the leather glove, embossed with Denton Logistics. A ripple of shock shot through the room. Pierce stepped forward. "We found this hidden behind a false wall in the barn, along with fresh footprints and scratch marks consistent with a child attempting escape." Judge Miller leaned forward. "Mr. Denton, do you recognize this item? Time 300 pounds. Denton's throat bobbed. "Lots of people have those gloves. They're company merchandise." Pierce didn't blink. "Except these gloves were part of a limited-run order only given to senior executives. The size matches yours. And Ranger," he paused, looking at the dog, "identified the location immediately." Weaver scoffed. "A dog is not a forensic instrument." Pierce stepped aside. "No, but he remembers." Emma gestured toward Lucy and Ranger. "Your Honor, with your permission, Detective Pierce will recreate the circumstances of the discovery." Miller hesitated, eyeing Lucy's fragile posture. But when the child looked up at him, Ranger pressed gently against her, and something in Miller's face softened. "Proceed." Pierce placed the glove on the floor a few feet from Denton's table. Ranger stood instantly, hackles raised, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. He stepped forward, not wildly, not aggressively, but with purposeful, unshakable certainty. His gaze locked onto Denton, teeth bared just enough to show recognition without threat. A collective gasp swept the gallery. Weaver shouted, "This is intimidation! Remove the dog!" But the damage was done. Denton's hands shook. Sweat beaded along his hairline. His breath hitched. And then the final blow. Lucy lifted her hand, slowly, deliberately. She traced the circle. Ranger growled louder, stepping closer to Denton's table. Weaver stammered, "Your Honor, please." But Denton's voice cracked through the courtroom, raw and panicked. "Get that dog away from me! Get him away!" Silence. Absolute silence. Judge Miller's gaze hardened. "Mr. Denton, why does the presence of this dog distress you?" Denton's breathing spiraled into frantic gasps. He remembers. She wasn't supposed to." His attorney grabbed his arm. "Charles, stop. Stop talking." But Denton tore away, eyes wild, pointing at Lucy. "She knows! She knows I was there! I just needed her quiet!" A scream echoed somewhere in the gallery. Reporters leaned forward in disbelief. Emma's jaw tightened, not in triumph, but in grim confirmation. Judge Miller slammed his gavel. "Mr. Denton, you have just admitted involvement in the child's abduction. The court orders you immediately into custody, pending formal sentencing." Denton collapsed back into his chair, shaking, defeated, the mask he wore for 2 decades shattered beyond repair. Ranger returned to Lucy's side, placing his head gently in her lap, as if to say, "It's over now." Lucy exhaled, trembling but safe, her tiny fingers curling into Ranger's fur. The courtroom remained silent, frozen in a moment the town would speak about for years to come. Snow blew across Main Street in thin, restless spirals as news spread faster than the wind could carry it. Charles Denton had confessed, inside the courtroom, in front of half the town. Frosthaven, a place built on tradition and familiarity, hadn't seen a scandal of this magnitude in decades, and certainly not involving a man they once trusted enough to hand ceremonial scissors to at ribbon cuttings. By evening, the town felt different, like someone had pulled back a curtain and revealed a shadow that had been there all along. The local paper ran breaking headline: "Community leader implicated in child abduction." The word leader stung Frosthaven harder than the crime itself. Store owners gathered in clusters at the diner, speaking in hushed disbelief. "I can't believe it," muttered Tom, the hardware shop owner. "He donated 10 grand when the school roof caved in." "He baptized my son," Reverend Matthews whispered, shaken. How could we not have seen it?" Over at the police station, Denton sat inside a holding cell. No tie, no polished smile, no polished reputation to hide behind. His hands trembled uncontrollably. Every time Ranger barked from the hallway or a police dog passed by, Denton jolted violently, pressing himself into the farthest corner of the cell. "Turn off that dog!" he shouted. But the hallway was empty. Judge Miller stood outside the cell, arms crossed, the weight of memory heavy on his shoulders. "You're hearing things, Mr. Denton." "No," Denton whispered, voice cracking. "He knows what I did." Miller leaned closer. "Ranger remembers what you tried to silence, and apparently, your conscience remembers too." Meanwhile, across town, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cooling tea between her trembling hands. Lucy was asleep on the couch. Ranger curled protectively around her. The glow of the lamp cast them in a soft golden halo, a scene so peaceful Hannah had to blink back tears. Emma arrived with Pierce not long after, both carrying the exhaustion of a battle nearly over. "You did the hardest part today," Emma told Hannah. "Your daughter's courage, and that dog's instinct. They broke the case." Hannah shook her head, voice quivering. "She's still so fragile. It's like she's walking on a thin sheet of ice. One wrong sound and she'll fall through." Pierce lowered his voice. "Not anymore. Denton can't hurt her now." Ranger lifted his head at the sound of Pierce's voice, blinking slowly before settling again. Lucy didn't stir, but her small hand found Ranger's neck, fingers curling into his fur even in sleep. "You know what he asked for in holding," Pierce continued. "A light on at all times. He's terrified of the dark." Emma scoffed under her breath. "Coward." "No," Pierce corrected quietly. "He's terrified of being alone. He's terrified Ranger could walk into that darkness and find him." Back in the jail, Denton sat rocking slowly, muttering under his breath. She remembers. She remembers. I thought the storm would bury it. You underestimated a 6-year-old and a dog, Miller said simply. The next morning, the community began removing plaques with Denton's name, school donors' walls, community gardens, a bench outside City Hall. Each removed plate felt like peeling away another layer of a lie they'd lived with too long. Reverend Matthews personally removed a dedication plaque from the church vestibule. His hand shook as the screwdriver slipped. "Dear God," he whispered, "how did we never see the wolf?" The truth was simple. Everyone trusted the smile. Everyone trusted the money. Everyone trusted the reputation. No one trusted the dog. Until now. And as Frosthaven reeled from its betrayal, Lucy slept soundly for the first time in months. Her breathing even. Her face relaxed. Her nightmares quieted by the warmth curled against her sod. Ranger blinked awake, watching her with eyes full of ancient understanding. Justice had begun, and healing would follow. The morning after Denton's confession, Frosthaven lay under a quilt of soft, newly fallen snow. The storm that had shaken the town was finally passing, at least the one outside. Inside the Hart home, however, the air felt almost suspended, like the calm after a long-held breath. Hannah moved quietly through the living room, afraid that even the creak of a floorboard might disturb the fragile peace settling over her daughter. Lucy lay curled beneath a thick, knitted blanket on the couch. Ranger nestled right beside her. The golden retriever didn't sleep deeply. His ears twitched with every sound, every shift of the wind outside. His body stayed pressed against hers as if he understood the importance of this first night, without terror. Hannah gently brushed a curl from Lucy's forehead. "Rate medium." "You did so well yesterday, sweetheart," she whispered. "You were braver than any of us." Lucy didn't stir, but her hand instinctively searched for Ranger's fur. He lifted his head, nudged her arm, and lay back down, keeping his warmth against her side. A protector even in dreams. Later that afternoon, at Dr. Eleanor James's office, the air felt warmer than usual, like someone had opened a window just enough to let hope in. Lucy sat cross-legged on the soft rug. Ranger curled protectively around her like a living rampart. Dr. James smiled gently. "Lucy, I want you to know something," she said, settling across from her. "What you did in that courtroom, that was incredible. You were strong, and you were safe. Ranger made sure of it." Lucy's eyes flickered, uncertain but attentive. Hannah knelt beside her daughter. "She's right," she whispered. "No one can hurt you now." For a moment, the room fell into a deep, still quiet, the kind that feels like the world is pausing, waiting. Lucy lifted her hand, not to signal, not to warn, but to rest on Ranger's scarred back. Her tiny fingers traced the line of the old wound as though studying it, understanding it, acknowledging it. And then it happened. A whisper, soft, fragile but unmistakably real, escaped her lips. "Warm." The word floated through the room like a miracle. Hannah froze. Dr. James inhaled sharply. Ranger lifted his head, his tail thumping once gently, as if to say, "I hear you." Tears welled instantly in Hannah's eyes. She cupped her hand over her mouth, afraid to gasp too loudly and break the moment. She had waited months, agonizing, sleepless months, to hear even a single syllable. And now, in the quiet safety of this room, her daughter had given her that gift. Lucy leaned closer to Ranger, burying her face in his fur, whispering the word again, more clearly this time. Warm. Dr. James gently touched Hannah's shoulder. "That's not just a word," she said softly. "That's trust. She's found her anchor." Ranger pressed his muzzle against Lucy's cheek, as if answering her. Hannah wiped her tears. "You saved her," she whispered to the dog. "You brought her voice back." Lucy reached for her mother's hand. Another miracle, soft but steady, linking the three of them in a fragile chain of healing. Outside, the snow began to melt under a faint sun, dripping steadily from the roof like the first notes of a song long forgotten. Inside, Lucy's whisper lingered in the air, gentle and warm, a promise of something new. The storm had taken her voice, but Ranger had helped her find the first piece of it again. The snow melt came slowly to Frosthaven, first in thin, glistening rivulets trickling down the gutters, then in soft patches of earth showing through the months-old blanket of white. It was the kind of quiet seasonal shift only long-time Minnesotans noticed, but this year it carried a deeper meaning. Winter had held the Hart family hostage. Now, at last, something gentler was breaking through. Lucy stood in the backyard, bundled in a lighter coat than usual, holding a piece of chalk in her mittened hand. Ranger sat patiently beside her, the sun catching the golden strands of his fur like threads of honey. For weeks, she'd refused to step outside without trembling. Today, she walked into the open air on her own. Hannah watched from the porch, arms wrapped around herself, not against the cold, but to steady the overwhelming ache in her chest. "Take your time, baby," she whispered, though Lucy was too far to hear. The ground was still damp from thawing snow, but Lucy knelt anyway, drawing careful shapes on the flattened patch of earth. Simple curves, tiny ears, little whiskers. Her favorite, cats. She paused often to look at Ranger, showing him each figure with silent, tentative pride. Ranger answered with a slow wag of his tail each time, leaning close enough for his fur to brush her sleeve. To anyone else, it looked like a dog observing a child's sketch. To Hannah, it was the first real sign that Lucy had begun reclaiming her world, one line of chalk at a time. Inside the house, a handwritten envelope sat on the dining table. Hannah had read the letter twice already, but couldn't bring herself to move it. Judge Owen Miller's handwriting was neat, deliberate, like a man who weighed every word with the care of someone who had lost too much already. "Dear Lucy, your bravery helped bring truth to light when our community needed it most. Ranger guided you with courage, and you guided all of us with your heart. Some heroes stand tall, others stand small but shine just as brightly. At the bottom of the page, in a soft, fading ink, my daughter believed the smallest voices often speak the loudest truths. Thank you for proving her right. Judge Owen Miller. Hannah folded the letter gently, unable to stop the tears that warmed her cold fingers. She looked outside again, where Lucy had drawn an entire family of chalk cats, each one linked by a tiny circle connecting tail to tail, a symbol only she and Ranger understood. "Sweetheart?" Hannah called softly as she stepped off the porch. "What are you drawing?" Lucy didn't speak, but she pointed at the largest chalk figure, a cat with a long curved tail, drawn with loving detail. Then she pressed her finger to Ranger's chest. "Family," she whispered, the second word she had spoken since the night of the storm. Hannah froze. For a brief moment, the world tilted. The trees, the melting snow, even the cold wind seemed to pause. She gathered Lucy into her arms, sobbing into her daughter's hair. "Oh, honey. Yes. Yes, he's family." Ranger pressed close to them both, resting his head against Lucy's shoulder with a soft exhale that sounded remarkably like relief. Later that evening, the three of them walked along Superior Lake's shoreline. The winter wind still nipped at their cheeks, but it was no longer the same cruel wind that had once stolen Lucy's voice. This one felt bearable, even hopeful. Lucy kept Ranger's leash in her small hand, though Ranger never once strayed far. The sun dipped behind the horizon, turning the lake into a sheet of molten gold. Lucy turned to Ranger, her breath forming the smallest cloud in the air. "Warm," she murmured, leaning against him. Hannah watched them, her heart full in a way she had forgotten was possible. Winter would always leave scars, literal and unseen. But this moment, this fragile warmth, was proof that scars didn't stop life from blooming again. Frosthaven's long winter had finally begun to thaw. The Frosthaven Community Hall hadn't been this full in years. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the room, coats draped over their backs, the smell of hot cocoa and winter boots mixing in the warm air. Outside, Lake Superior sent a cold breeze rattling against the windows, but inside, there was a quiet hum of hope. The town had gathered to honor the search and rescue team, the people and dogs who had braved a deadly storm to bring their children home. Lucy stood just behind the curtain with Hannah, her tiny hand clutching Ranger's leash. Ranger sat calmly beside her, tail sweeping small arcs across the wooden floor. He sensed the anticipation, but more importantly, he sensed no fear in Lucy today, only a soft, trembling excitement. Hannah knelt, straightening Lucy's coat. "You don't have to speak, sweetheart. Just walk with him, okay?" Lucy nodded, her breath forming a faint glow in the cold draft from the door. Ranger nudged her hand with his nose, gentle reassurance. When the announcer called Ranger's name, a wave of applause swept through the hall. Hannah squeezed Lucy's shoulders. "Go on, baby." Lucy stepped onto the stage. At first, she hesitated under the bright lights. But when Ranger brushed against her leg, She moved forward with newfound steadiness. The applause quieted into soft murmurs of admiration. People weren't cheering for a dog alone. They were cheering for the little girl walking beside him, the girl who had survived a nightmare she could not put into words. The sheriff handed Lucy a small medal on a ribbon. "For Ranger," he said gently, "the bravest boy in the storm." Lucy didn't speak. Instead, she lifted the medal with both hands and looped it over Ranger's neck. The moment the medal touched his fur, Ranger pressed his head to her chest. A simple movement, but powerful enough to bring several people in the audience to tears. On the front row, Judge Owen Miller watched with an expression that softened the deep grief carved into his face. Pierce and Emma sat beside him, both silent, both moved in a way only those who had carried the weight of this case could understand. Lucy turned toward the crowd. For a split second, her eyes darted in worry, an old reflex. But she didn't hide, didn't shrink, didn't tremble. Ranger stood tall at her side, and with that, something inside her unlocked. She whispered into the microphone, so faint it felt like a memory drifting on air. "Thank you." Gasps, hands over hearts, awe spreading like sunlight. Not because the word was loud, but because it existed at all. Hannah covered her mouth, shoulders shaking with emotion. Dr. Eleanor James dabbed at her eyes. Pierce bowed his head, blinking hard. Even Judge Miller closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him like the first warm day after a brutal winter. Lucy's voice, fragile, soft, surviving, echoed through the hall, and Ranger, sensing the importance of the moment, gave one soft bark. It wasn't sharp or alarming. It was proud. The kind of sound that said, "We made it." When the ceremony ended, the townspeople gathered around Lucy and Ranger. Children asked to pet him. Elderly women pressed knitted scarves into Hannah's hands. Teachers hugged Lucy. Even the mayor leaned down and said, "You've given this town its heart back, kiddo." Outside, twilight settled over Frost Haven, the cold wind sweeping from the lake. But it no longer felt like a threat. Lucy stepped out into the open air, Ranger walking beside her, his leash held lightly in her grasp. They paused at the top of the steps, looking out at the lights blinking across town. The wind brushed Lucy's hair. Ranger leaned in, and for the first time since that terrible night, the world didn't feel like a place that could swallow her whole. It felt open again, wide, full of echoes she wasn't afraid to hear. "Home?" Hannah asked. Lucy nodded. "Home." The three of them walked into the Ha'chung evening together. Mother, daughter, and the dog, who had carried her voice back through the darkest of storms, and Frost Haven, once fractured, began to stitch itself whole again. The courtroom was unnervingly silent as 6-year-old Lucy Hart stepped through the heavy wooden doors, her tiny hand clutching the leash of Ranger, the search and rescue dog who had once pulled her from a collapsing barn during a blizzard. Outside, snow drifted past the frosted windows in slow, ghost-like sheets, driven by a northern Minnesota wind sharp enough to split bark. Inside, the overhead lamps cast a tired amber glow. An old courthouse that had seen decades of disputes, but never one quite like this. Everyone rose as Judge Owen Miller entered, his black robe brushing the rails, his eyes carrying the quiet ache of a man who had buried a daughter 10 years earlier. He had presided over hundreds of cases, many darker than the Midwest winters he lived through. Yet something about today felt heavier. As he settled into his seat, his gaze drifted toward Lucy. She looked impossibly small inside her navy puffer coat, her boots barely brushing the floor. At her side, Ranger moved with the steadiness of a seasoned protector. The golden retriever's coat, thick and winter-ready, shimmered softly beneath the courtroom lights. A faint, jagged scar along his flank caught Judge Miller's eye, an old battle mark from the night he'd saved Lucy's life. The dog paused, sniffing the air, his muscles instantly tightening. Lucy hesitated, then took 2 small steps forward. She did not speak. She hadn't spoken a single word for nearly 3 months. The trauma of the blizzard, the night she vanished, the hours trapped under rotting beams, things no child should ever endure, had severed her voice. Not even her mother, Hannah Hart, could coax a whisper from her. Now, as they reached the witness stand, Hannah leaned down and murmured, her voice trembling, "You okay, honey?" Lucy didn't respond. Instead, she reached for Ranger, resting her hand along his back, grounding herself in the warmth of the only being she fully trusted. Across the courtroom, Charles Denton watched with unsettling calm. His suit was ironed to perfection, his coat draped neatly over the back of his chair. In this small Midwestern town, Charles was known as a generous business owner, a church donor, a man who always shook hands firm and smiled wide. Yet as his gaze slid over Lucy, something sharp flickered behind his eyes. Cold, calculating. Ranger felt it first. A low rumble traveled through his chest, his tail stiffening as he stepped closer to the girl. Judge Miller straightened. "Mr. Denton, is there going to be a problem?" His tone was neutral, but his stare was pointed. Denton raised his palms in an easy shrug. "Not at all, Your Honor. Just surprised to see the child here today." His voice had that unmistakable Midwest drawl, soft, warm, deceptively ordinary, the kind of voice you might hear while buying groceries or discussing property taxes, the kind of voice you never suspect of cruelty. But Lucy suspected. Her fingers curled tightly into Ranger's fur,